This is the Sales Bible Podcast, episode 336, How to Build a Sales Estimating Process That Works, an interview with Marcel Petipas.
Welcome to Sales Babble, the podcast that shares selling secrets for non-sellers. And now your host, Pat Helmers.
Hello, Sales Babblers. This is Pat Helmers. Have you ever earned a new customer that actually cost you business? Your ability to predict success for a service industry is dependent on your skills to estimate accurately. Too often, businesses fail to have a profit-centered process when selling. Yep, sellers are able to close deals, but sadly, way too often, these deals don't pay the bills. Well, according to our guest Marcel Petipas, revenue is a liability unless you make a profit. In this episode, Marcel's going to share his sales estimating process for making solid estimations that add to the bottom line. But before we get to the interview, I want to do a shout out to our new sponsor, Parakeeto. Parakeeto generates data-driven estimates and gives you real-time feedback as you tweak budgets, hours, and services. Parakeeto provides tools and templates you need to share and manage the right metrics and grow your business's profitability in seconds. Parakeeto, your business profit toolkit. And also Sharetivity. Sharetivity helps salespeople increase prospect engagement by providing an easy and fast way to personalize your outreach on LinkedIn. Sharetivity, one-click personalization. And so, with no further ado, let's get to it. Welcome, Marcel. Are you ready to babble?
I'm ready to babble.
Marcel, I got your LinkedIn profile pulled up here, and you have an interesting conversation about snow that you start out with. You're in Canada, correct?
I am in Canada.
Where?
I'm in Moncton, New Brunswick, just north of Maine.
So what's the story about you and your brother shoveling snow?
Yeah, I mean, we thought it was a good way to make some extra money on a day off from school. We were snowed in, and so we said, why don't we go out and shovel some driveways, see if we can make some money? And that was going really well for a little while. Our neighbors were kind. They paid us handsomely for the time that it took us. And then we reached one house, and we thought, oh, this will be easy. We went up to the door, and we offered to shovel this old lady's driveway, and she offered us a toonie a piece, which is a funny Canadian coin that's worth $2. And we looked at the driveway. We thought, oh, that's not a big deal, because it just looked like there was a thin dusting of snow on there. And then once we started getting into it, we realized that her driveway hadn't been shoveled in a long time, and there was this thick coat of hard packed icy snow underneath the fresh white stuff. And I think we must have been in her driveway all afternoon for our $2. So when we did the hourly rate at the end, it wasn't much more than 50 cents an hour, and we were pretty upset with that. And I think that's the first time I realized that when you do a service business, when you run any kind of service, the gap between your assumptions and reality can often be the difference between making money and paying your clients to work for them.
So this goes right down to the whole point that I have you here on the podcast, is that when you estimated the work, you estimated poorly, right?
That's right. Very poorly.
And you're an expert at estimation, because I think what I see here, you're the founder, or a co-founder of Parakeeto. They do estimating, right?
That's right. Yeah. I mean, we started as a consultancy, and our focus was on helping service businesses become more profitable. And through that consulting work, we discovered that, the foundation of a profitable service business is the ability to accurately predict how much it's going to cost you to earn your revenue.
Where do people get this wrong?
Well, I think the first thing is they think of revenue in a service business as being theirs instead of thinking about it as a liability until it's earned. And I think that's a really important distinction to make, because unlike most other businesses that, they have a fairly predictable cost when it comes to earning their revenue. For example, a product company, roughly how much it costs you to build your product and sell it. In a service business, your cost is how much time it takes you or your team generally speaking. And so if you are wrong about that, then your margin is going to be flexible, and often flexible in the wrong direction, which is not what we want. So that's the big consideration that a lot of people just kind of overlook. They sell something for 10 grand, 20 grand, 100 grand, and they think, great, I just made 100 grand. And they're not thinking about, okay, I have to be as efficient as possible in delivering what I promised to the client so that we can actually maintain some profitability here.
Yeah, revenue is not profit, is it?
Not in a service business, it's not.
No. It may not be in a product business either.
That's fair. That's fair.
Because it reminds me of there was this old joke on Saturday Night Live where this guy was making change, and I could give you, 10 dimes for $1, 100 pennies for $1, da 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 da. And somebody asked, well, how do you make money? And they said, oh, volume. But that's not the case, is it?
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing that I see all the time, right? Is you get agencies or you get service businesses that, usually I see this happening right around the $1 to $2 million in revenue mark, where they're busy, they're selling lots of revenue, and yet the cash flow is really poor. And a lot of times, as an owner, you're kind of sitting there scratching your head thinking, how can we be this busy and we don't have any money left? And often that's a symptom of the business not having the processes in place to consistently earn the revenue in an efficient way. So what that means in short is that they're probably spending a lot more time doing jobs than they should be, or that they think they are. And therefore they're not able to earn as much revenue as they need to with their overhead and headcount to, make a good margin. And often the answer to that is they try to sell themselves out of that problem. And the issue here is actually going to be exacerbated if you sell more. So volume in this situation, a service business, can actually be, more like driving the business off a cliff than, trying to actually fix it. But often, the symptoms are that of starvation, but what you're actually suffering from is what I like to call indigestion in a situation like that.
Indigestion. Mm-hmm. Why that word?
Well, I think so many in that case, right? When you're thinking, man, I just need another 10 grand so I can pay rent and get payroll done, you'll take on just about any kind of work in that situation, whether it's in your wheelhouse or not, whether it's a good client or not, whether it's something you've done before or not. And that's when you start to introduce yourself to a lot of risk in these projects. And most of the time, especially if you're not billing by the hour, if you're billing flat rates or value-based, which most folks are these days, then you're taking that risk on as a service business. And that's how you end up being crazy busy. And the team's trying to tie off all these loose ends and working overtime to get these projects across the line. And the revenue just does not reflect the amount of effort that's going in.
Yeah. So what can people do to get around this? What I'm hearing is that they're kind of living in a fear mode. They're taking on business as it comes along. What can people do to overcome this?
Well, so there's a couple of fundamentals, and then there's a framework. And so I'll start with the fundamentals. The first fundamental, of course, is that, and it's appropriate that we're talking about this on the Sales Babble podcast, is, having a strong pipeline is certainly the backbone of being able to do all of the things that are required for you to maintain a very profitable service business, because you need to be able to confidently say no to work or confidently fire a client that's not a good fit so that you can replace them with someone that is, or with work that is. So that's kind of the first and most important thing, right? Make sure that you have a predictable way to create pipeline, to book sales meetings, and to get business in the door so that you can go ahead and, basically pull your socks up and be a little bit more stern with the scope of work that you offer, the relationship you have with your clients, how you communicate with them. Once you have that done, then it really comes down to systematically measuring the difference between your assumptions and reality when you're doing service work. So, of course, regardless of how you price, when you give a price to a client for a service, you're basing that on some kind of an assumption, right? About how long it's going to take you, how long it's going to take your contracting team, perhaps how long it's going to take your internal team, or how much cost you're going to incur in terms of marked up services or, pass-through revenue. So you have this set of assumptions. Either it's baked into a price card or you're coming up with it during some kind of an assessment or discovery process. And then you're going to go out and do the work. But where most people stop is right there. They go and they do the work and they don't take the time to go back and say, okay, were our assumptions correct or not? And so the first piece of this kind of framework to improving your agency's profitability is to say, whatever the structure of our estimation is, and you should standardize that so that it's the same every time. Well, we should set up our cost and time tracking tools to map exactly back to the way that the estimate is structured, so that it's extremely easy for us to go back at the end of every project and say what went well and what didn't go well. And most of the time where we see the disconnect is the time and cost tracking tools and the estimates don't match up at all. And so it becomes this very arduous and painstaking process to go back and answer those questions. And so those questions never get answered. And so we have business owners, directors of sales, whoever's involved in the quoting process, that have this kind of false belief that they're really good at quoting work. And unfortunately, they're probably eating 10, 20, sometimes 30% of the gross margin on every project, and they're not aware of it. And, we know that that's probably all the profitability potentially of that business at the end of the year. So this could make a huge, meaningful difference in the amount of money that the business is able to reinvest or give to the shareholders or give to the owners at the end of the year. So that would be the first place to focus, is get some data so you can actually see what's going well and what's not going well, and where are the gaps in our assumptions when we quote work for clients.
Getting data to fulfill a feedback loop makes a lot of sense. Why don't people do this?
Well, it's mostly because it's not that easy to do, honestly. A lot of times, actually, where I see this breakdown is, there's two fundamental places where I see it break down. The first is in the structure of the data. And so often we see businesses using these fully integrated business management tools. So they're managing projects, maybe they're doing their sales, they're doing their time tracking, everything in one solution. And where I see that breakdown a lot is where the project management philosophy differs from the estimation philosophy. So a simple example of this might be, we're running a digital agency. And so when we're estimating this project, let's call it a website, we're saying, okay, this is how many design hours it's going to take. This is how many project management hours it's going to take, how many development hours it's going to take. And that's all great. So at the end, we have an estimate that's structured that way. And then when we move into the time tracking tool, it's tied to the project management tool, and you end up with time tracking data that looks like this. 6 hours for wireframing the UI, and 4 hours for, writing the copy for the homepage. And so we have all these tasks associated to time that don't map cleanly back to a design, development, or project management task that we've estimated in. And so in order to answer the question of how much time do we actually spend on design compared to our estimate, we've got to reconcile this data because it's not structured the right way. So oftentimes the first solution there is to really audit your tooling and ensure that there's a way for you to structure your projects in your project management tool in a way that works for your project management team, and then structure your data independently from that so that it works for your operations team and you can map it back to your estimate. And that might mean using separate tools. It might mean using naming conventions. It might mean using a tagging system, right? But that is one of the first and most important places that we start to see the disconnect. The accounting tool is no different. You've got this chart of accounts, or you've got a way that it's set up in your accounting tool that just is not conducive to answering those questions quickly and easily. So optimize for that first. The second is just way too much complexity or not enough complexity in the way that we actually break down our data. So, really a simple way to say this is some people try to track everything, right? So who did the work, what task it was done on, what service that was associated to, what, sub-deliverable within a deliverable that was associated to. And that level of granularity becomes extremely difficult for your team to maintain. You're asking them to track, down to the very precise minute on the precise task. And then you end up generally with very incomplete or inconsistent data because it's too complicated to track. The inverse of that is you keep it too high level, and then your time tracking data isn't useful to answer those important questions. And again, those same kind of concepts can apply to your accounting tool. So it's really important at the beginning of auditing your tools that you sit down and ask yourself, when something goes wrong in one of our services or projects, how do we audit that? Reverse engineer your thought process. Are you asking more questions about the people involved? Are you asking more questions about the process and where things broke down? Are you thinking more in terms of what area or what team had trouble? Or are you thinking more in terms of what phase, what task, what deliverable went wrong? And as you reverse engineer your thought process, that should shed some light into, okay, where is the appropriate place to introduce complexity? What are the important questions that we need to answer? And where can we make some compromises? So you can find, the correct level of detail in the way that you set up your data at the onset and set up, your time and cost tracking tools so that they're not too complicated, but they're just complex enough to answer those questions that are most important.
There's a lot here, Marcel.
There is. There's a lot.
I'm hearing you got to be formal with your project management. You got to have formal process management. You have to formalize your account management. All this needs to interwork with each other. They very well could be on different tools. I think of a software project. I can see people maybe having the energy to wrap around this. But if I look at it from, let's say, I do construction management, and I'm a general contractor, and I bring a lot of people together, I might be very comfortable winging a lot of this, and I may have winged it all my life. So this is a lot of work. How can organizations that don't have a lot of staff, get their hands around this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, obviously, the most of the work is in the upfront, right? Most of the work is in setting up the tooling, setting up the reporting. But the objective here should be to make it so that it's extremely easy to go and ask one of these questions and have data come back to you to answer that question. So it shouldn't take you 2 hours in a spreadsheet to answer that question of, did we spend as much time on framing for this new house build as we thought we were going to? You should be able to pull that report very quickly, or contact your project manager or whoever runs these reports for you, and they should be able to pull it very quickly. So that's the objective of the work we do up front. But then the second part of this is actually getting your team involved, and this is the second part of the framework. So the first part, we talked about data, right? And that's a qualitative feedback loop. That's objective information that you can use to kind of get a sense of where are we doing well, where are we doing poorly. The second part of this is actually defining a cadence, right? And this is really important. Defining a cadence that's sustainable and that's reasonable based on the amount of turnover you have in your business, right? So, let's say you run a home building company and you only build 12 houses a year. Well, you might not need to sit down and talk about this every week. You might not only need to sit down and talk about this every month or maybe every quarter, depending on how quickly things change. So define a cadence that's sustainable for you. And then that cadence defines how often you should be looking at this information and then sitting down with your team and saying, hey, here's a few things that went way better than we expected. Why did that happen? What was it about that was so efficient, so great? How can we make sure we replicate that in the future? And then here are some areas where, what happened was not at all in line with what we expected. What do we think happened? Why do we think that is? What processes and procedures can we put in place to prevent that from happening again? And that helps them come to the table, surface, nuanced information from the trenches, create some buy-in so that when you say, hey, that's a really great idea, would you be comfortable leading this initiative and implementing that process change? They're more likely to say yes and get bought in. And then it doesn't necessarily have to come down to you exclusively as the owner or as the management team to be thinking about and being a steward of the profitability of the business. The whole team can kind of get bought into that process. And again, you get to define the cadence. You get to define how often you're doing this and how much time you're investing in it. But what's important is that it happens consistently. And over time, if we do these two things, if we measure the data and we measure the qualitative feedback from the team and improve processes, and what we're essentially doing is we're closing the gap between our assumptions and reality over time, because the data helps us get a sense of, the objective ballpark of how long something should take. The process helps actually make the distribution of those data points tighter and closer to a line of best fit, because it reduces the level of risk that something is going to take much more or much less time than we planned, because we now have a more predictable thing that we're trying to predict when we do the estimation process. So those two things combined should start to close the gap over time. And again, the cadence is what's important. You decide how often and how much time you want to invest in that.
This sounds like something that the sales folks should be driving.
The sales team can and should be very involved in this. And this is where the data can become really helpful, right? If I can say to you as a salesperson, hey, here's 5 projects or 10 projects or 20 projects from the past that, when somebody comes in and says, hey, we need a website, you can go to those 20 websites and pull it up and create a line of best fit. Then all they need to know is what's the budget, or what's the, whatever your input metric is, I like to call it, right? So most service businesses, when you're having a sales conversation, you're asking questions from the customer. You're trying to get a sense of, what they need. And you're going to have some number that you're going to get from them, some quantifiable feedback from them that's going to help you inform, how big and complex is this project. So if for a house, it might be number of square feet, number of bathrooms. For a website, it might be number of web pages, or it might just be their budget. Right. So as you collect those things, you can start to build a relationship using data between that input and the level of effort and time or money that's required to get that done. And you can base that on historical data. So now your sales team, they just need to know, okay, cool. How many square feet do you need this house to be? And then, a couple details here and there. And then they can say, okay, well, if you're looking for 2,500 square feet finished, then that house is going to cost you $240,000, give or take 10%. And they can get in the ballpark very quickly. And so I think the common misconception here is once you have these processes standardized, getting an accurate estimation that's based on historical data doesn't actually have to take very long. And that's the misconception, I think, with estimation is if we want it to be really good, we've got to invest a ton of time into it. And if our close rate's 30%, then that means that 2/3 of the time we're wasting that time. But actually, that's not necessarily true. If you can standardize this process and get some data behind it, you can get very accurate and still be very, very efficient. And your sales team can set you up for success in the beginning, which, often is not the story. I think I hear this a lot in the agency space. There's this tension between the delivery team and the sales team because they're closing stuff and it's underpriced or it's overscoped and they're throwing it over the fence. And it's almost like they're dropping grenades on the production team. And that tension doesn't have to exist. Those two teams can work together to make sure that they're both being successful and they both have the tools they need to do their job effectively.
Yeah, I hear this a lot too. There's that eternal struggle between the two.
And I get it. The sales team wants to hit their quota. They want to close deals. They're trying to, get a solution to the customer. And they don't necessarily know the nuances of what it's going to take to deliver that solution. And they don't necessarily need to, nor should they. Their focus is on, bringing business into the organization. So, it's our responsibility as owners to empower them with what they need to, be stewards of profitability and to still be able to keep their sales motion moving forward.
As I said at the top of the interview, I said you're the founder of Parketo. Who's the ideal client?
So we generally work with service businesses, primarily agencies that are somewhere in that 10 to 30, 40 employees range. And we help them do this process. We help them create data-driven estimates in seconds using data about their past projects and empower whoever's doing the sales to come up with that number very quickly and very confidently.
If people wanted to find you guys online, where would they go?
Well, they would head to parakeeto.com. And if they wanted to find a toolkit that we put together for them to help them, work through improving their profitability, they could just head to parakeeto.com/toolkit. And if they wanted to listen to our podcast, they could head to any of the podcast networks that they listen to and just type in the Agency Profit Podcast.
Well, I didn't know you had a podcast.
I do.
Yeah, I don't know if you know this, but I'm a strong believer in podcasts.
Well, that makes two of us, and here we are on a podcast. How meta is that?
How meta is that? If you could give our listeners one piece of advice they could go and take action on this week, what would that be?
I would say my biggest piece of advice would be sit down and formalize your estimation process. If you can do that, then you will make everything in your life a lot easier. So just standardize the way you do that, whether it's a spreadsheet, whether it's, a Word document or a napkin that you're drawing things on while you're on a sales call. Just nail that process in and formalize it. And that will give you a foundation to build the rest of the processes in your business around to actually get the visibility you need to scale faster and protect your profits and make more money at the end of the day.
I like that. A lot. And if I could add one thing, do a feedback loop on it.
100%. And that's the reason standardizing it's the first step, because if you don't standardize it, then there's a moving target. You can't create the feedback loop because the inputs and outputs are changing. So if you can just fix one end of that spectrum, then it allows you to create that feedback loop. And that is an incredibly insightful thing. I think it'll open your eyes to a lot of things that maybe you were feeling in your gut, like these customers aren't great to work with, or this client's kind of a pain in the butt. But once you see the data, you can't hide from it anymore. I think you'll have a couple come to Jesus moments.
Excellent. Excellent, excellent. Marcel, thanks a bunch for babbling here on Sales Babble. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure, Pat. Thanks for having me.
Sales starts with getting your prospect's attention. Given all the noise, you have to be different. You have to personalize your outreach. Unfortunately, it's time-consuming to go to Google, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube to find an icebreaker. It's a conundrum because personalized outreach converts significantly higher than canned emails. Picture the possibility that with one click, you could get a social footprint of your prospect, which would make personalized outreach faster. With Sharetivity, you instantly discover personal information regarding your interests, college, and social media posts on LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. With Sharetivity, you can make each outreach personalized, yet fully automated to fill your pipeline. Sharetivity is a Chrome extension. Search for it in the Chrome Web Store. It only takes 2 minutes to download, and soon you'll be skyrocketing your prospecting productivity today. Sharetivity. One-click personalization. Like Marcel said, too often businesses take on any project just to keep an inflow of work. This attitude is suicide for a business. Instead, create a sales estimating process that works. Provide quotes and bids with profits built in that enrich the organization. To learn more about Marcel, you can find him and links to Parakeeto at www.salesbabble.com. This Thursday, we're going to be hosting a conference call for Sales Babble listeners. Each week, we have new topics regarding lead gen, code calling, closing sales tips, and more. It's a conference call, so there's no need for you to dress up for a boring Zoom call. Dial dressed as you are. It's the Sales Babble Telebabble at 4 o'clock Central, 5 o'clock Eastern, and 2 o'clock Pacific time. Go to salesbabble.com/telebabble and find the conference bridge and sign up for an email reminder. Hope to see you there. Now, if you got a question or comment about this episode or any episode, don't hesitate to reach out by clicking on the Babble Me button on the website. Would love to hear what you think. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please give us a 5-star listener review on whatever podcast app you're using. Word of mouth grows the podcast. Well, that's all we've got for today. So until next Tuesday, take care and have a highly successful and a profitable selling day.
Thank you for listening to the Sales Babble podcast. Find us at www.salesbabble.com.
This is a production of Habanero Media.